Welcome to our web chat discussion on Treasury outsourcing, which is a highly topical item at the moment. And we've got two very experienced people in Treasury. Colin Evans, founder of EliteTreasury and Independent Consultancy, currently engaged with Sheet Group. Andrew Marshall from SLG Treasury, who is well known for his long-term association with AstraZeneca and many other large corporates. And we're going to be discussing what to keep in-house, what to outsource, how and when. The issue, gentlemen, it seems to me that you can't avoid this. CEOs and treasurers are insisting on increasing the amount of outsourcing. It's just a matter of managing it. And the first question really is, what do you keep in-house? Andrew, what do you think is absolutely vital to keep in-house?
That's a good question, and it's one that sometimes seems to get, Treasury seems to be pulled along in the sort of general let's outsource everything discussion. But there's certain areas that personally I see as being fundamental that they still remain within Treasury, and that's really the value-added task where decisions need to be made. And that is where typically I've seen examples where processes are outsourced to a generic outsourced company where any decisions or input or experience of Treasury or understanding is lacking, and that's really where you start to see problems. So it's really the value-added high process or processes that require decisions to be made, that's really the key areas that I see to be remaining internally.
Colin, is that what you've experienced?
Yeah, Jack, I think there's a trend around outsourcing, and there's a tendency just to use it as a blunt instrument without standing back, taking a look at the outsource proposition that's being considered and how widely it's going to be implemented. And I think there's a big difference between potentially outsourcing generic functions and tasks and going the whole way and actually outsourcing key Treasury skills and expertise. But I also feel that if you go that far down the road, you lose the ability of your Treasury function to potentially change, improve and innovate within the organisation, because you're effectively fixing it as an external service that's being provided, and it's no longer an influencer within the organisation.
But turkeys never vote for Christmas, and so treasurers are desperately trying to hang on to jobs where CEOs and CFOs could argue that it's still not necessary it can be automated. How do you differentiate? Because as you automate more, you actually encapsulate the decisions within the Treasury process, so it can be outsourced.
Okay. I will go back to something I've said for many years around outsourcing, Jack, which is if a service provider wants to bid for an outsourcing business, it's because they think there's some profit in it. And if an organisation has got a number of competitors trying to win that business, I think there's a step that the organisation needs to check internally why they would be giving profitability to an external company without using that streamlining and automation internally to actually generate more internal profit centre income.
Yeah, but if a third party can do it, why not let them? Andrew?
Well, that's the key, for me, is the key question, because what I really look at is the actual capabilities of that third party. Now, where outsourcing is done purely for a cost saving, I'm very, very negative on that whole concept. But where a third party can perform a task or manage a series of processes that they could do better for one reason or another than you could yourself, then I'm very much in the pro camp for it. But it's really about that capability. Can they do the task better than you could do yourself? And if that is the case, and that is a proven case, then I think the business case becomes very strong in favour of outsourcing.
Yeah, but the real problem is differentiating between what is core and value add and what is automatable. How do you, in your consultancy, how do you help clients differentiate between those?
Well, that's the key areas between what stays in and what stays out. And from what I've seen in terms of recent experience, it's very much around the value added for outsourcing is very much around the sort of high volume, low input or low experience of treasury function that you can very easily outsource. Typically a payment factory or something along those lines that's generic, involves very minimal experience or knowledge of treasury or the process or even the business itself. That's certainly one side in the processing side, but also the other side that we see is very much around the technology piece. And as these systems over the years have become more complex and the treasury function has become more integrated to different systems and multiple third-party providers, maintaining that process and maintaining all those touch points becomes more and more complicated. Now, the knock-on effect of that is treasuries or corporate treasuries certainly have over the years struggled to actually firstly identify that kind of resource that could manage that internally, secondly to train them, but thirdly, most importantly, is actually to retain that expertise within the company. So you can build up
a problem with third-party providers in getting them to retain the experience in their organization. The turnover can be huge.
Well, that's really why the tasks that need to go across to the outsourcing provider can only be those very generic tasks, which you could effectively manage through a decent set of process notes. You shouldn't be, in my view, passing over tasks that require in-depth knowledge of treasury or in-depth knowledge of the business. I think you're asking for trouble if you go down that road, but if it's very generic, very straightforward, then I think then there's a cost saving. Then I think that, as before, the business case becomes a strong one.
But Colin, that distinction between automatable and requiring treasury experience and knowledge, that's very difficult. How do you persuade your clients to differentiate?
I think the first thing is there may be a point in the evolution of the company where it actually is the right thing to do, because I think Andrew touched on the fact technology is moving at such a pace that for organisations sometimes to upgrade the particularly generic functions can be more expensive because they've got to invest in infrastructure, programming, etc. And it may well actually be able to sell itself if the provider is committed to always maintaining state-of-the-art technology. And I think the key thing around staff turnover and rotation, etc., is if you're going to go into this, go into it with your eyes open, get very good, very accountable service level agreements. Let's have clear understanding from the provider from day one, during the bid phase, what they're going to provide and what penalties would be applied to them if actually they weren't delivering in terms of deliverable metrics that are agreed up front. So I think within the client organisation, if they were committed to outsourcing, I'd be looking to have them be in the driving seat and taking control of that relationship rather than just going along with what's being particularly pitched at them by the provider. Okay,
you both said there are pieces that can be outsourced and you'd be comfortable with it, but you started to touch on the management of these third parties with the SLAs and so on, but that becomes an enormous commitment. And
yes,
you can be, I've talked to people who've had, it's got so bad that they've insourced it. How do you manage this, Andrew? How do you don't get to the position where you have to take it back in-house?
I think the first step in the process, or the first step in identifying the processes or areas that you're looking to outsource, is to make sure before you outsource it, that process is running extremely well internally. I think what I've seen in some recent examples is if you outsource a process that doesn't really work that well internally, it's only going to get worse on a multiplier effect. So if you can't hand over a perfect process, you're asking for trouble further down the line.
Yeah.
So it's really it's clearing up your own internal system and set up before you outsource it.
Yeah.
I think if you outsource rubbish, you're going to get rubbish, more rubbish.
Don't put crap in a new wrap.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Excellent point that, Jack, that Andrew's making. I think you almost, if you don't understand what it is you're trying to reassign to the external provider, you've got a problem. And I think you almost need to stop, do an internal audit and fully appreciate what the processes are, the nuances behind them, the staffing levels that are required, the IT levels that are required before you even start going into that phase of talking to external providers. Because I think the point is absolutely made and clear that if you don't have a robust process, managing it externally is even more difficult than trying to manage it internally when it's not working properly.
But the CFO has just said, we're going to outsource 30% of your staff.
Mm-hmm.
I'm cutting the numbers from, I don't know, 12 to 8 or something. You often don't have time. So what are the sort of combination of analysis that you were talking about takes a long time. Typically, how long does that take?
I think the answer, Jack, is if you're talking about global organisations, particularly if they're covered by things like Sarbanes-Oxley or other internal governance, that should be part of the natural process in the first place. So what should be required is a refresh. If you're talking to an organisation where the CFO has got these deadlines, but it's clear that the organisation doesn't have a clear picture of what it is that it's trying to assign, I think someone's got to have an honest conversation with the CFO and see if he's still willing to stick to that deadline, or if he's actually realises that perhaps extending that deadline will get a better result. How
do you manage this, Andrew? Because it's absolutely key, because they are insisting on outsourcing, keeping the numbers down, at least static and preferably lower numbers in the department.
Well, my old always default response where this type of thing is for these type of questions are thrown at Treasury is to put back the size and the complexity and the volumes and the large sums of money that are actually involved. And if you start to quantify one missed payment on a bond repayment or a coupon or a dividend payment, you can start to build a very strong business case as to why you think it shouldn't happen. It then basically becomes the issue for the CFO to decide whether a cost saving of $1 million a year on an outsourcing a particular set of processes is worth the risk of failing to make a dividend payment or something of a similar sort of size and potential negative knock-on impact to the company. And some of the corporates, I mean, fortunately, with some of the corporates we've been working with are dealing in such huge amounts of money on a daily basis that you can make it quite unpalatable for a CFO to actually consider outsourcing some of those key tasks purely because of the size and the potential cost and reputational damage that could be inflicted if these outsourced companies don't operate at 100% accuracy.
Colin, how have you managed this?
It's a good question. I mean, ultimately, the treasurer or the consultant doesn't really control the budget, doesn't control the decision. He really is just the implementer. I think you've got to do risk analysis. I think you've just got to prove that either the concept that's being proposed is supportable, or if it's got holes in it, I think you've got to address those holes, because you wouldn't be doing your client, or if you were the treasurer, you wouldn't be doing your board a service by just accepting it as a fait accompli. And I think, therefore, risk analysis and everything that goes with it is a key part. Another point I wanted to touch on as well is quite often these decisions are made in a silo mentality, that someone will look at the cost of the service being performed internally, the saving that's made externally, but there's usually conversations that can be had with tax departments about alternatives. So if there's a shared service culture in that organisation, couldn't the shared service culture take on some of that work internally in a location where it might actually be an even more tax-friendly break for the company than just going for a blanket saving through outsourcing?
Okay, the other thing that has been floated is that as we get more and more advanced treasury systems and processes and linking of one system with another, that actually once you've fully studied a process that could be outsourced and automated it, it's actually more expensive to outsource it because you're then having to manage a third party. How are you dealing with this, Andrew, as the treasury systems get more and more effective and more value add in terms of an awful lot of things, not just the decisions, but also the number crunching, the payment processing.
But it very much gets, as Colin said, it very much comes down to how you start with the SLAs and the conditions within that SLA. Ideally, at the outset, you've got to identify the key deliverables that you expect as an absolute minimum from the outsource provider. But it's how you manage that going forwards in terms of the relationship with that third-party vendor, how you manage your monthly meetings, how you keep track of these key deliverables over a period of time. And that's the key thing. I think if you start to have a disconnect between the Treasury and the outsource provider, it becomes very, very difficult to maintain that, and it becomes very much more of a reactive relationship. But I think if you approach it in a very proactive way, you work together to identify the things that are working well, the things that aren't working so well, you can start to form quite a good two-way relationship. But if the relationship starts to feel the pressure early on and you're not managing that properly, or you're not putting sufficient time and effort into making that relationship work, again, you're on a very slippery slope there, and it becomes harder and harder to do so. So you've got to set off with the right intentions.
But and I know you've been personally involved in actually saying, sod it, we're going to have to insource this because it's just not working. How do you manage, I know Colin's been involved as well. I'll start with Colin. How do you manage this insourcing once it's gone belly up in terms of working?
Apart from putting your head in your hands and thinking, why did we ever do that in the first place, and counting the cost. I think part of it is when you set the original project up to go outsource in the first place, there needs to be a mindset in the company that says, what's the backup plan? And we need to make sure that the infrastructure and locations are in place, that if we have to take it back, that we're actually able to do so and not scrabbling around for a solution. The other thing, to Andrew's earlier point about managing the suppliers, a really good reputable outsource supplier should be able to provide you with immense amounts of data which will give you early warning if things are not working. And therefore, as long as the person managing the process is knowledgeable about the processes that are outsourced, that should make life a lot easier as well. But just coming back to the insource thing, you've really not got to close all the doors. You've got to leave some of those doors open in case you've got to do an about turn. And it can be due to M&A, it can be due to change of ownership, buyouts and things. It's quite often change of a CFO who's against outsourcing, saying, well, why did we do that in the first place? I passionately think it should be insourced. Therefore, the organisation needs to remain flexible.
Are there any lessons from your experience, Andrew, in terms of the insourcing, managing insourcing?
I think as these relationships come to a point where it becomes inevitable that the process or tasks have got to be brought back in-house, I think the writing's on the wall typically for a period of time. It's how you manage that and how you plan for that. I think one of the example you're quoting is really technology driven, where in the old days certain tasks were easy to outsource because, for example, let's say a bank or a financial institution could perform those better than the corporate because they had better systems, better connectivity. But I think nowadays what we're seeing now is the treasuries and the treasury systems and the integration with third-party systems is that much better that you can actually do things as well or if not better than a bank can do on your behalf. So it's kind of identifying whether the original business case for outsourcing is still valid. And that's very much what happened in the example you're referring to, that the business case that may have been valid 10 years ago is no longer valid because we could actually do things ourselves. So it's keeping a regular monitoring of that process, whether that's through the relationship management, whether it's through identifying the key deliverables and the metrics of how they're performing against what you think you can perform yourself. But it's an ongoing process. But I think you've always got to be aware year to year when you do your annual review that you question whether that relationship and whether that outsourcing is still valid in the environment that you're currently in.
I was just going to add, Jack, as well, is I know when you're negotiating up front and everyone's got the warm, cuddly feeling of a new provider and outsource, that quite often don't want to think about the end game, but it's crucial that within the contract negotiations that provisions are made for exit, for taking back services, almost as if you build in a transitional services agreement obligation on that supplier, that if you do decide to insource, that you've contractually gained their cooperation. and also access to perhaps the system services that they use, that you may be able to access them directly, so that you engineer some kind of a soft landing into the terms and conditions, rather than having to have a very difficult conversation with a potentially adversarial provider when you tell them that you're going to exit, because insourcing is always still a possibility for many reasons. And with so much technology now available via the cloud, one of the big plays for the outsources before was they used to host lots of servers and data rooms and all that stuff. That's old hat. And as it goes on the cloud, it should be easier for companies to simplify these tasks themselves and automate them.
The other point that I didn't quite get around to mentioning was, I was going to say, it's this, when you've pushed on by the CFO to say, okay, we're going to make $2 million as cost savings a year through this outsourcing opportunity. But what I don't ever see is a year on or 2 years later, you review retrospectively to say, okay, we saved 2 million in headcount, but our internal resources have had to spend X thousands of hours fixing the issues, resolving the problems, trying to address some of the mistakes they've made, trying to investigate also some of the interest claims and some of the direct cost implications of some of the mistakes. That never seems to get quantified. And that, to me, is a big source of frustration. You still sit behind this, we're saving $2 million a year on headcount, but no one takes into account how much time the Treasury guys that remain in Treasury spend cleaning up after this outsourcing company. And to me, it is a huge pain of frustration, but it just doesn't seem to get tackled.
Yeah, and Andrew, how much collateral third-party damage is being done to your suppliers and your customers as a result as well? That's all not quantified.
Yeah, none of this is quantified. It's brutal on an organisation, and I see that in Treasury. There, they spend hours upon hours trying to resolve problems that have been made, and some of the direct cost implications of some of these mistakes are astronomical. I mean, I'm talking 10 times the annual cost savings that were touted in the original reason to do it.
Okay, guys, thank you very much. That was really
pleasure. Really enjoyed that, Jack. And Andrew, thank you.
Thank you very much.